and I know Mary and FRC would argue that with this level of complications, there is no reason that this drug should be on the market for this indication. We would not allow any other drug to stay on the market with this kind of complication rate, especially when it's not treating any kind of disease.
Outstanding is a production of The Washington Stand, your source for news and commentary from a biblical worldview.
Welcome. You found the Outstanding podcast. On this show, we take on issues in the culture, news, and politics from a biblical perspective. Now, you may remember the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in June of 2022. The pro-life movement rightly celebrated this as a major victory and an answer to years of prayer. But since then, something kind of incredible and kind of terrible has happened. Since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, abortions in the U.S. have actually increased, not decreased. How can that be? Well, we have two amazing experts here to explain and tell us what's going on in this issue and how you can be involved. Mary Szoch, she's the director of the Center for Human Dignity at Family Research Council, which has been at the forefront of the abortion pill issue. And we also have Dr. Christina Francis. She's a board-certified OBGYN, who's also the CEO of the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs. Thank you both for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, I want to go first to you, Mary, but I do want to note, Dr. Francis, this is my first meeting with an OBGYN.
Well, great.
I just realized that. Yeah, had this revelation now. But Mary, I'm going to come to you in a moment, Doctor. But Mary, I just want to come to you first because this question has been bothering me. I can't really believe it's true. How in the world can it be that post Roe v. Wade, under the Trump administration, with a Republican majority in the Senate and the House, that abortions have increased in the U.S.?
Well, it's certainly tragic that abortions in the U.S. have increased over the last several years. But we really have to look at the history there that happened. So Roe v. Wade was overturned in the summer of 2021. And of course, Joe Biden was president during that time. And the Biden administration really geared up for the overturn of Roe. Roe being overturned wasn't shocking it was shocking in that it actually happened, but it wasn't shocking from a was this law actually constitute, or was this previous decision actually constitutionally sound? Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg knew that Roe v. Wade was not constitutionally sound. So Democrats had prepped for this for a long time, and the Biden administration did everything that they possibly could to expand abortion during Biden's presidency, which made up, the majority of the time that we've had since the overturning of Roe and since the Dobbs decision. For the time that President Trump has been president, beginning in January of 2025 here, we've actually seen Guttmacher just put out numbers showing that there was a decrease in the number of abortions. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about that because the work that the Biden administration did to expand the horrific and tragic practice of abortion has made it so that the reporting numbers on abortion are no longer relevant. The Biden administration allowed mifepristone to be dispensed through the mail without any sort of interaction with a physician. And this is not only dangerous, but it renders pro-life laws in pro-life states null and void because it allows those drugs to be shipped over state lines. And those abortions, unfortunately, not only are dangerous and tragic, but they're also not tracked in any way. So we don't know what number of complications these women are having. These are abortions that are outside the healthcare system. We do know that women are ending up in emergency rooms, and we've seen the stories of this. We've seen Catherine Herring. We've all heard of these women. And that's the tragedy of what the Biden administration did and what the Trump administration is working to undo.
Okay, so I asked a very difficult question to start. Thanks, Mary, which is how in the world can this be? And it sounds like the simple answer is, well, there's this abortion pill that's getting sent all around the country. And regardless of state laws or, work that people have been doing on policy for a long time to stop it, you can just circumvent it. And because it's very hard to track if someone takes a pill in their home, or if they order a pill and they keep an extra or something and they take it later, or they order, they see 3 different doctors and they get prescribed 3 pills from 3 different people, and then they save it for a rainy day and take it next year. Makes it very difficult to track it because people can do it via telehealth. Okay. So that begs the question, Dr. Francis, I want to bring you in. What is the chemical abortion pill? How does it work? And I guess, how does it kill the baby?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as Mary stated, we have seen just unfortunately an explosive growth of the use of drugs to induce an abortion as opposed to surgical abortions over the last 2.5 decades since the drug was approved in the US, but in particular in the last few years, given how this pill is now being dispensed, or these pills. I do think it's important that people understand what we're talking about when we talk about abortion pills. So we're not talking about like Plan B or the morning after pill that people will talk about. That's something very different. This is actually a 2-drug combination that women take when they already know they're pregnant. So they've had a positive pregnancy test, and then they take these drugs to induce an abortion. The first drug, as Mary said, is called mifepristone. And this is a drug that works to combat the ability of a key hormone in early pregnancy called progesterone to do what it's supposed to do, which is to support that early baby as he or she grows inside of mom. Progesterone is crucial for helping mom and baby develop connections to one another, connections that allow for the free flow of nutrients and oxygen and all of those important things that developing baby needs, and especially until the placenta starts to develop and take over that role. And so mifepristone, I always tell people, think of it like a key that you can insert into a lock. So it goes into the lock, but it won't actually turn the lock and unlock that lock. That's what it does at the receptor site for progesterone. So it binds to that receptor and it blocks the ability of progesterone to do what it needs to do. In doing that, it cuts off those key communications between mom and baby, and that leads to the starvation and asphyxiation, really, of that baby. So it deprives that baby of the nutrients and the oxygen that he or she needs to continue to survive. And then that's followed 24 hours later by a second drug called misoprostol that we actually use quite frequently in the field of obstetrics. We use it to induce labor at term. We use it in the medical management of miscarriage. And in this circumstance, it's used for much the same purpose or the same effect, in that it puts women into labor. And so then a woman will then go into labor and she will deliver her baby that usually has died prior to that. But sometimes those babies are actually born alive if the mifepristone didn't completely work to end that child's life. And so women are delivering then their babies at home. They're delivering their babies in their dorm rooms. And so it's harmful for many, many reasons, which I know we're going to get into, but not just the physical harms, but the mental harms as well, that women are laboring oftentimes alone in their homes and delivering their babies at home. And this is being sold to women as easy and simple and safer
Right.
than Tylenol, when in fact it is not.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up, Dr. Francis, is you often hear something like, well, this is less traumatic for women because if you want to save babies, you must hate women. And I can see in your eyes that you both just hate women. It's very obvious from this, right? But of course I'm joking, but the argument is, well, the abortion pill is less traumatic. It's safer and all stuff. But the process you described to me just now sounds pretty dramatic and traumatic. And the idea that you could actually in your home, there's a chance that you're going to have a baby that is going to die in your arms or on your bathroom floor or something, which is something that's not going to happen in a surgical abortion, actually.
Right.
That sounds pretty traumatic. We talk about the mental health and then hemorrhaging and things like that. I mean, is it really safe, actually?
No, so it actually isn't. And it's the reason why, of course, APLOG, the organization that I represent, of course, we advocate for the lives of our preborn patients, but we also care very deeply about the lives of our maternal patients as
Of
well.
course.
And so that's one of the biggest reasons why we have been fighting against this drug being on the market since almost immediately after it came onto the market. And actually, Family Research Council has been a valuable partner with us in that fight. So with our first citizens petition that was filed in 2002, just 2 years after this drug was approved. And the reason why is because even at its baseline, this drug is very dangerous for our patients. Of course, it's completely lethal for our preborn patients, but it also carries a very high risk for our maternal patients. It actually has a 4 times higher complication rate than a surgical abortion, which I think is counterintuitive for many people. People just automatically think that a surgery would be more dangerous than taking some kind of medication. And so that's why it's been so easy to sell this lie to women, because I think it's sort of common sense that people would think, oh, taking a drug has to be safer. But in fact, as you alluded to, there's a much higher risk of hemorrhage or very heavy bleeding that requires blood transfusions. That requires emergency surgery because of an incomplete abortion where not all of the baby or not all of the placental tissue passes out of the woman's uterus. And so she needs an emergency surgery to complete her abortion. Something that I have been forced to do, forced in the sense of because I've seen patients who come in who are unstable and bleeding so heavily that they need an emergency surgery. And so I've had to do that emergency surgery for them in order to save her life.
From the abortion pill.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Including even now in my home state of Indiana, where abortion is largely illegal. And as Mary said in the beginning, it's because of the way these drugs are being dispensed that it really negates all of the laws that so many states have worked so hard to pass to protect their citizens. And then the mental health trauma, I don't think we can overstate this. And it's something that is not being talked about enough, I don't think. Women are being told to flush their babies down the toilet. And I hate to be very blunt, but I think people need to understand this is what they're being told to do. And women are seeing their babies, they're delivering their babies, they're recognizing them as their babies, and they can't flush them down the toilet. I mean, that just goes against, I think, everything inside of them. And so now they're being left wondering, what do I do with my baby? And the trauma, not only of laboring, oftentimes alone, as we said, delivering your baby, seeing your baby, but then the fact that the abortion facility has now become her home. And so, I've talked to many women who had abortions in their past who, had it done at an abortion facility who said they never drove by that facility again because there was so much trauma associated with their abortion that they didn't want to be reminded of it. But how does a woman get away from the trauma when the abortion facility is her bathroom? And every time she goes in there, she's reminded of what she went through. This is an all-out war on women, and I think we need to be listening to more women who are trying to tell their stories and being told to be quiet by the pro-abortion side because what they're saying goes against their narrative. And women need to be aware of this as well if they're in a situation where they're contemplating taking these drugs because they think that they're safe, and they need to be aware of these potential consequences.
Well, I mean, I think you just made a great point there. And I'm going to come to you in just a second, Mary, but I want to clarify something you said because I'm told this doesn't happen, Dr. Francis, which is you personally have seen patients, women who are in life-threatening danger because they took the abortion pill and went wrong, and now they need you to basically save their life.
Yeah, yes, I'm seeing it on a regular basis, and this is in a state where abortion is largely illegal. And just my group alone, thankfully, Indiana has an abortion complication reporting law. So every time we see a complication of an abortion, we legally have to report it to the state. Just my group alone in one city in Indiana is reporting a handful of these every month, actually. And this is in a state like Indiana, like I said, where abortion is largely illegal. So imagine what people in other states where this is being done more frequently are seeing. This is something you ask anybody who's being honest, any physician who sees patients in an emergency room, if they're being honest, will tell you that they're seeing these on a regular basis.
And I know there was a recent report that studied hundreds of thousands of women looking at insurance claims and found that there probably were actually, there actually are a lot of these cases that have gone underreported. And RFK Jr. actually testified before Congress recently, and he said that the Biden administration has hid and manipulated, basically hid the data on the abortion pill to prevent it from coming out how bad it is. Mary, you said at the beginning of this episode that the Trump administration is working on this issue, and I think a lot of people were hopeful about that and were encouraged when RFK said at that same congressional hearing that he was going to review the abortion pill and take a step back and say, okay, we need to look at the health impacts of this. There are some legitimate concerns, and he even said that those concerns, the data backing up those concerns, had been manipulated and hidden. But then we had a generic version of mifepristone just approved. And I think this surprised a lot of people on the right, a lot of Trump supporters, a lot of Republicans who are very loyal to Trump, who were surprised by this. I don't know if the president was aware this was even going to happen, or maybe it was just on the schedule. And, there's some FDA staff who are just kind of doing what they think is right. But can you explain what happened there, and how can we approve a generic version of a drug that was supposed to be under review for its safety?
Well, I think a lot of people in the pro-life movement were shocked by this. I know at FRC we were taken back by it. I imagine Christina can speak to at AppLog's reaction to it. But this is something that should not have happened. If a drug is under review because it causes a serious complication in 11% of women, there's no reason to approve a generic version of that drug. And certainly there is the question of, well, was this just part of the process, and was it on a schedule that it had to be followed? But if the drug is unsafe for women, expanding access to it is certainly not the answer. This is something where we, as pro-lifers and as members of the pro-life movement, need to hold Dr. McCary accountable for this and need to be speaking out. I know FRC has a petition where we're asking for the immediate reinstatement and strengthening of the original safety precautions for mifepristone while the review is taking place. And we want to make sure that review is a transparent and unbiased review, because realistically, if mifepristone is reviewed by the same career members of the FDA who conducted the so-called review of the drug back in 2000, we're in a lot of trouble. But if it is a transparent and unbiased review, one that involves the ability for people like Dr. Francis to look at the data and to say, hey, yes, this actually tracks with my real life experience as an emergency room doctor who's seeing these patients, then I think we'll see a shift on mifepristone. Women don't want to be taking a drug that's going to send them into the emergency room with hemorrhaging that could possibly end their life. The FDA needs to recognize that, and they need to make the decision to revoke the approval of mifepristone. But while they're waiting to do that, they need to immediately reinstate those REMS, ideally immediately stop the distribution of the drug completely until that review's done. But if that's not going to happen, immediately reinstate the safety precautions and add an ultrasound so that at least the damage that's occurring, the harm to these women, can be mitigated.
Yeah, it is kind of an interesting point. I haven't thought about it like that, but okay, so for the federal government, for RFK Jr. to say, well, this is probably unsafe, and the data that showed how unsafe it was hidden, so we're going to review it, but while that review is going on, just have at it. Here's a couple more. So to say that there's legitimate safety concerns here that need to be reviewed, but in the meantime, people can keep taking something that might not be safe from the FDA. That's pretty troublesome. And then you mentioned these safeguards, Mary. I'm very concerned about the politicization of healthcare. We saw this a lot during COVID, where there was a lot of politics influenced what was actually real science, or when we didn't have real science, we just kind of made some assumptions and put a scientific label on it. And a lot of people were hurt by that. And a lot of people don't trust scientific experts anymore because of things like that, which I think is not good for people to lose trust in science generally. But the scientists kind of did that to themselves in a lot of ways. So, Dr. Francis, what are these safeguards that were in place and were normal earlier in Biden's term to protect women that then, because of a political motivation to expand abortion access in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade's overturning, he then got rid of the safeguards so that any woman could get these pills? What were those safeguards for seeing doctors, the medical side of this, to make sure that women were safe that are not there any longer?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad you brought up the politicization of medicine and healthcare. And as you said, we've seen that in many instances, but I think I don't know of a more clear example actually than the example of mifepristone. So even if you look at from the very beginning, its approval, how it was sped through the approval process to fulfill a campaign promise by Bill Clinton before he left office, so that he could get it approved and into the US before he left office. So it was approved through a rapid approval process. In order to do that, they had to label pregnancy a life-threatening disease in order to approve mifepristone, which of course it's not. In fact, it's a sign that a woman's body is functioning in the way that it is supposed to function if a woman becomes pregnant. So, the political push started there, but when it was approved, the people approving the drug recognized that it had inherent severe potential side effects. And so because of that, they only approved it with certain safeguards in place, which later became known as REMS. Some of those safeguards were that it was only approved through 7 weeks of pregnancy. A woman had to have 3 in-person visits if she took this drug. So 1 in-person visit before she was given the drug, and then 2 in-person follow-up visits to ensure that she wasn't having complications and to ensure that she had completed her abortion. It had to be dispensed by physicians only. And all adverse events, any side effects, any adverse outcome had to be reported to the FDA. These were the safeguards that were put into place to try to mitigate the complications. And those remained in place until 2016, when again, in another political move under the Obama administration, the FDA made really sweeping changes to those safeguards. They expanded the use of the drug up to 10 weeks of pregnancy from 7 weeks, even though they knew, based on the original studies that were done, that once you got to about 8 weeks of pregnancy, the rate of complications related to these drugs started to exponentially increase. And yet they expanded it to 10 weeks anyways. They took away the 2 in-person follow-up visits and said that a woman only needed an in-person visit before she got the drug, but did not need follow-up. They also said that non-physicians could now prescribe this drug, even though non-physicians are not qualified to manage the complications of these drugs. And even though they did all of that, knowing that that would increase the risk of complications, they also said, now the only complication you have to report to us is if a woman dies. Other complications, you don't even need to tell us about that. Even though they knew that making all of these changes were going to increase the rate of complications. Then fast forward to 2021, again, another political move under the Biden administration. They decided, and this really, I think, was, all of these changes were egregious, but I think this one was maybe the most egregious. They took away that in-person dispensing requirement. And they said, well, look, we made all these changes in 2016 and there was no increase in complications. So we're fine to do this. Well, guess why there wasn't an increase? Because they weren't collecting those complications.
Right.
And why this is in particular very dangerous is there's multiple reasons. One, without an in-person visit, a woman cannot possibly receive fully informed consent. Part of informed consent is telling a woman about the risks of that drug in her particular situation, which means you have to know exactly how far along she is in her pregnancy. We don't know how far along women are if they're just getting online without an ultrasound and without an in-person exam. You need to know that she doesn't have an ectopic pregnancy, which is the leading cause of death in the first trimester for women. This is something that kills women in this country still, even with good access to medical care. And it's particularly dangerous in this situation because the symptoms of a rupturing ectopic pregnancy, which can lead to her death within a matter of hours, are the same symptoms as a woman experiences when she is undergoing a chemical abortion. And so that means that if she has those symptoms, but she's taken these pills, she's going to think those are normal symptoms related to her abortion. And she'll stay at home and lose crucial minutes and hours that could be the difference between life and death for her. We also can't ensure that we know who these drugs are going to when a woman is not coming in person. And we've already seen the fallout from that, as Mary referenced at the beginning. Abusers who are forcing abortions on women who don't want them because they're getting these pills online and they're putting them in their girlfriends or their wives' drinks, or forcing them on them. So there's a number of reasons why this is dangerous. And then women don't have follow-up care. This is pure patient abandonment. It would be medical malpractice in any other aspect of healthcare. There's nobody else who would get away with handling quote unquote medical care this way. So these are all the reasons why it's dangerous and where we're to now. And, I'll just also bring up a point of the importance of follow-up visits, because I've heard some people say, well, is it really necessary? Can't you just tell women the symptoms to watch out for and let them know when they need to follow up? I was speaking with a colleague recently who saw a patient who took these drugs in the second trimester, well beyond the range of when it's approved by the FDA for women to take them. And she was suffering complications because of that. The reason she took them in the second trimester is because she had ordered them online about 4 or 5 weeks before and was unsure about what she wanted to do. So she waited and was trying to decide what to do. And then 4 to 5 weeks later, decided to go ahead and take the pills. Had she had an in-person follow-up visit, somebody would have known that. They would have known that she hadn't taken the pills, and hopefully would have told her why it would be dangerous to take it, beyond that window, even more dangerous to take it beyond that window. So to me, that just highlights perfectly one of the importances of having those follow-up visits. Women deserve that kind of care, and women that are, making the, I think, unfortunate choice to choose to have an abortion, just because I don't agree with that decision doesn't mean that she is any less deserving of excellent health care. But in fact, that's what women are receiving in this country today.
Yeah, I mean, there's the moral question of abortion, which is, pretty hashed out, and, killing a baby is murder, and it's wrong. But now we're not just killing babies; we're killing the women who are killing the babies because we're lying to them about what even the risk of their own abortion. And some of these women, they're in a very difficult spot, and they're trusting the experts. And now the expert is somebody out of state on a telehealth, visit, who's not even a doctor,
Right.
who's giving them a pill, not knowing if they're ectopic, not knowing how far along they are, not knowing anything about probably about their medical history, not an in-person visit.
Right.
It's just taking abortion, moving it to an Amazon model.
Right.
And there's human casualties from that.
Right. And if I can just point out too quickly, I think a lot of people have in their mind that this is like a telehealth visit that's happening when it's being dispensed online. A telehealth visit means you're sitting down with, at a computer screen with a medical professional who's actively talking to you. That in large part is not what's happening. In large part, women are filling out a form online, which may or may not be reviewed by a medical professional a month or even 2 months later after these drugs have already been dispensed, if anybody's reviewing it at all. So it really is not even telehealth, because it's not any meaningful interaction with a medical professional, much less a physician. But it usually is just a form that's filled out online, and then the drugs are sent to them. So it's even less than a telehealth visit, actually.
Is there any other drug you can get this easily, this dangerous? I can't even get an antibiotic this easily.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly not one that carries this kind of risk, but right. I mean, even antibiotics, in order to get prescribed that, you have to have some kind of personal interaction with a medical professional.
Wow. Okay. And so I want to go back. You made a point about the data as we get closer to the end here. The EPPC released this report, which found that in nearly 11% of cases where women take the abortion pill, they have some adverse effect within 45 days, often very, basically lethal, as we're describing here. And a lot of pro-choice people immediately attacked that report and, called it some kind of pseudoscience or thing, even though they looked at 865,000 cases of prescribed mifepristone, which is an incredible number. I mean, your average poll or something, it asks like 1,000 people. So to study that many people it's a lot of cases. And the report was attacked, but from what I'm hearing from you and what I'm hearing from RFK is the established data is false, because RFK himself said the Biden administration hid it. And now you're telling me, Dr. Francis, that if something, an adverse effect does happen, they don't have to report it. So the official federal data on this is totally incomplete and misleading, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the importance of this study that was released was that it looks at real world data and it doesn't rely on someone reporting a complication. Because the other thing is, even with what is required to be reported, the method in which it gets to the FDA, oftentimes it's going through the manufacturer. So there's a problem there because they obviously are going to have a conflict of interest in reporting anything that comes to them. But there's also good papers out there to show that the FAERS system, the FDA adverse event reporting system, has only picked up likely about 6% of actual complications that have occurred. And there's, like I said, good peer-reviewed papers out there that show why that's the case. So we know that the FAERS system is woefully inadequate to show the actual complications. And the peer-reviewed studies that the FDA claims to be using to support its position that this drug has a less than 0.5% severe complication rate, there's a few problems with it. One, they don't look at all of the complications that this newer report looked at and those complications that we're seeing. But two, those were studies that were done in very controlled clinical trial circumstances where women oftentimes were actually screened with ultrasound and had their gestational ages confirmed before they were entered into the trial.
Right.
And then, complications were reported, and this was all done in a very controlled circumstance. The benefit of this insurance claims data is its real world use of mifepristone.
Sorry to interrupt, but so what you're saying is in that study, they screened out the high risk women,
Right,
the very women who would be the victims. In
exactly.
This, right? Okay.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's not happening the way these pills are being dispensed now online, of course. And so, I was doing an interview shortly after that EPPC report came out, and the reporter asked me if I was surprised by the data, by the fact that, as Mary said, nearly 11% of women suffered a severe complication. And I said, no, because it's completely consistent with what I'm seeing in my practice. And so that's the power of this data. As you said, it's the largest data set that has ever been looked at related to mifepristone, and it's showing real world use, and it's not dependent on someone reporting it because it's looking at insurance claims. And so this is actually really strong data as far as the validity of the data. And it's not like we're the only ones who use insurance claims data. In fact, I found after that came out, I found a couple papers from pro-abortion researchers that used insurance claims data in a variety of circumstances. And so this is something that we use oftentimes to track the safety or the complication rates of something once it's been approved. Then we look at insurance claims following that to look at complication rates. So this was a very, very important data set that came out that, again, is consistent with what we're seeing in clinical practice and should be used by the FDA as a safety signal, as Mary said, that those original safeguards should immediately be put back into place. Ultrasounds should 100% be required for every woman before she takes these drugs while they're doing a review of the safety. I know Mary and FRC would argue that with this level of complications, there is no reason that this drug should be on the market for this indication. We would not allow any other drug to stay on the market with this kind of complication rate, especially when it's not treating any kind of disease. It is being used purely for elective purposes.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Francis. Mary, I want to give you the last word here with a couple of questions, and then whatever you want to add. I'm kind of struck by the fact that you could have pro-life laws in your state. You're a Christian who believes life begins at conception. God values every life. We're made in the image of God. You work hard. You get a pro-life law passed in your state. And now it seems to me, and I want you to answer this, it seems like that law is being totally circumvented by this. So that's the first question. And then the second question is, let's say you have a meeting with the president this afternoon. What are you saying to him after you say, "Hello, Mr. President, thanks for meeting with me"?
Boy, that's quite the question.
It is,
for the first one, this is certainly the result of the Biden administration. Again, they removed the in-person dispensing requirement for mifepristone, and then Biden Department of Justice issued this opinion on the Comstock Act, that the Comstock Act says that you basically can't send something through the mail that is going to induce an abortion. And the Biden administration said, well, we will enforce this as narrowly as possible, meaning basically not ever.
So it's already
these,
illegal to do this, actually. It's just not enforced.
It is. It's a violation of federal law, yes. But that law is not being enforced. And people say things like, oh, well, that law is so old. Well, a lot of the laws that we actually enforce are pretty old. In fact, people are
First
frequently
Amendment's pretty
arguing that something is against, violates your First Amendment rights. Exactly. And we're all fine with that. So, these pills are being shipped across state lines, and we have women, we have the story of a woman whose boyfriend held a gun to her and forced her to take those pills. We have stories of women who were in a relationship that was clearly abusive, where they said, okay, I'll just take it and then I'll throw up afterward, and then couldn't. We have women who had mifepristone sprinkled onto their pancakes without their knowledge. And this is happening time and time again. And at some point we have to stand up and say, okay, enough's enough. We can't continue to violate federal law here. We can't continue to make it so that pro-life states can't actually protect unborn children and women. It's just so shocking to me that those on the left are opposed to protections for women. I'm not surprised that they're fine with the killing of unborn children in this incredibly brutal way. But you would think they would at least care about those children's moms. And of course they don't here. Secondly, if I had the opportunity to speak to President Trump today, certainly I would address world events that occurred today. But if we were talking solely about mifepristone, I think I would share with him those stories of those women whose lives have been tragically changed forever, and whose hearts are broken and whose bodies are broken because of this drug. And I think I would share with him the ways that the Trump administration could work to pull this from the market. President Trump has been the most pro-life president in the history of America. He worked to overturn Roe v. Wade, and he was proud of that. He, in his first month in office, he reinstated the Mexico City policy, reinstated Hive, re-signed the Geneva Convention. His vice president's first public speaking appearance was at the March for Life. RFK Jr. said, I agree with President Trump that every single abortion is a tragedy. And what we need to do is make our voices heard as pro-lifers. So I'd encourage anyone listening to this to sign FRC's petition that asks for the Comstock Act to be enforced. That's Pam Bondi over at the DOJ. Hey, we know you've got a lot going on, but let's put this at the top of the list. Mm-hmm. And then ask Dr. McCary to let's make sure that review of mifepristone is both transparent and unbiased. And in the meantime, let's either stop the distribution of mifepristone until that review can be completed, or let's reinstate all those original safety requirements strengthened with an ultrasound.
Well, thanks, Mary. I hope you get that meeting. And, I joked at the beginning that you guys hate women, which was clearly, just playing around. But it's clear from listening to you that you actually really care a lot about these moms, and not just the babies. You care a lot about these women. You're seeing it firsthand. You're reading these stories. And there's a deep compassion that I hear from you. And I really appreciate that, and really appreciate your perspective. But we are out of time for this episode. This is the Outstanding Podcast. Thank you for listening. Please like, share, subscribe, post it online, put it on your Facebook, send it to your friend. As I always say, the algorithm is not always our friend, because we're not afraid to take on tough issues, and we're not afraid to do it from a biblical perspective. So we rely on you to grow the audience, to get the word out. And I thank you for many of you have been doing that, who've been commenting and the like. I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate Dr. Francis and Mary. Thank you guys so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Outstanding is a production of The Washington Stand, your source for news and commentary from a biblical worldview. This podcast is made in the USA by producer Casey Harper, production assistant Rachel Woods, technical producers David Salkeld and Yusuf Fletcher, and executive producer Jared Bridges. Help support us by texting the word outstanding to 67742 and read more at washingtonstand.com.